Welcome back. In the last chapter, we've covered the grand sweep of the ideas of board games and even created a simple one. Now it's time to start talking about some of the other elements of game design: player agency, randomness, and stakes. If you haven't heard those terms, don't worry. We'll give you a simple explanation here and expand on these concepts throughout the video. Patrick, do you want to explain these ideas?
Sure thing, Stephen. Player agency is the ability of players to influence the game outcome through their actions and decisions. Randomness is the degree to which game elements are influenced or created by chance rather than player agency or predictable game mechanics. And last, stakes is anything that will be lost or gained by the player for each action within the game.
Thank you. So let's delve further into these concepts. Agency is the term for the player's influence over the game by making choices. This is usually most visible in genres like role-playing games, where players encounter a continuous series of choices that lead to different results and sometimes fundamental changes to the story or game. Agency is a crucial component to games intended to be skill-based, such as chess, where random elements may skew the contest. However, agency and randomness are not mutually exclusive, as we'll get to shortly. You see low agency in games such as the game of life, where you only have a few choices on branching paths, or the game War, where you actually have almost no agency. You don't impact the order or the usage of your cards. High agency would be chess, as we mentioned, or the game Go. Players have total control of how their pieces are used in these games. In RPGs, players are able to choose both their approach and their methods to the game as well.
Randomness refers to the degree to which game elements are influenced or created by chance rather than player agency or predictable game mechanics. Randomness can provide increased replayability by lowering repetition. It can also reduce skill gap and skill expression. These reductions can be favorable or sometimes not favorable, depending on the game's target audience. Randomness also adds tension because the elements in question cannot be entirely predicted. Randomness can also be pure by relying solely on a randomizing agent, the shuffle, spin, or dice throw, or it can be controlled by other aspects of the game. These sort of mechanics can be dice spinner modifiers, rerolls, or special card actions. Each choice of how to generate randomness also determines the probability of the results. For example, choosing to only use one six-sided dice instead of two or more limits the range from 1 to 6 instead of 2 to 12. Use of multiple dice will also lead to more results towards the middle, as opposed to use of a single multi-sided dice. Another example may be using a spinner with a certain amount of spaces, some of which may repeat the same option. This is commonly seen in D&D and other role-playing games where a character's attributes can affect their capabilities.
Stakes refer to anything that will be lost or gained by the player for an action within the game. Stakes may just be the overall chance to win the game, or there may be direct victory points or other currency to gain or lose each round. Regardless, the player should have a sense of weight to their choices when seeking victory. Not every choice of action needs to have direct stakes, and the stakes don't always have to be measurable. However, when adding a choice to the game, be sure to consider if that choice should have ramifications for the player. If it will, make sure it is communicated to the player in the rules or gameplay. Stakes should be balanced so that leading players feel rewarded for their previous gains, while trailing players feel they can still catch up. If a player loses all chance of winning in the first action, the rest of the game will feel pointless to them. Similarly, if a player maintains a lead all game and then loses in a single turn, they may feel their efforts were wasted. This is especially important for games with a high degree of randomness, where the player may not feel they had control over their situation. For example, most forms of billiards have a version of losing if the 8 ball is pocketed before it is meant to be. Skill overcomes this, usually. On the other hand, if it was entirely random if you lost the game because the 8 ball was pocketed for some reason you couldn't control, it would be very frustrating.
Let's look at an example. In the game Dice 10,000, you start by rolling 6 dice. While each roll may seem completely random, the player has several choices they are able to make. Players are attempting to get a 1, a 5, or a set of 3 or more of the same value on their dice. If they roll successfully, the player can then choose to keep those dice and roll the rest, reducing the number of dice they will then be able to roll to attempt to get more successful results. If all 6 dice are successfully matched to a point value, the player gets to add up all their points and start over with all of their 6 dice. Let's talk a second about dice rolls. In statistics, you have probability, which is the extent to which something is probable, the likelihood of something happening or being the case. Mathematically, it is the number of favorable outcomes over the number of potential outcomes. For example, in Dice 10,000, we're working with 6-sided dice. If we are looking for either a 1 or a 5, then we have 2 favorable outcomes for that one die. If we do the math, we see that we have a 33% chance of getting a 1 or a 5 on a single dice roll. So if you roll more dice, you have more chances to get a 1 or a 5. As a game designer, think for just a moment. What would happen if in Dice 10,000, we used 20-sided dice instead of 6-sided dice? How would that change both the game and the chances within it? Despite the dice being highly random, the player has several choices they get to make within Dice 10,000. They can decide the number of favorable dice outcomes. For example, the 1 and 5s they just rolled, they will keep in order to have a higher chance to roll something better the next roll, such as trying to get more 1s, 3 of a kind, or more of the same values that they already rolled. Each time they make a decision, they have less dice to roll, therefore decreasing their odds. At first, the entire game may seem to run only off of randomness, and it's true that this game has a high amount of randomness. It's based on 6 six-sided dice, and 6 six-sided dice has a lot of variation. The rolls the player makes comprises the stakes that they have. However, the player can choose which of their dice amounts to keep or to lose in order to have a higher favorable dice roll outcome on their next roll. If they don't roll any favorable numbers, however, they risk losing everything that turn.
Player agency and randomness are balanced differently from game to game. Player agency can be highly pronounced, such as in chess, or it can be very limited, such as in blackjack. However, some degree of player agency is necessary to make a player feel invested. Consider that even in a coin toss, the choice of heads or tails is often given to the person not making the throw. Agency and stakes are almost always present in games to some extent as well. As a designer, your task is to identify how much agency you wish to give players for each action and how much each decision should matter to the player's overall chance of success. Limiting agency can be necessary to drive a narrative, streamline gameplay, or prevent exploits. Similarly, adjusting stakes can impact the perception of each turn or action's value, leading to a more relaxed game or a more intense one. Poker is an example of a game balanced around both chance and player agency. The core mechanic of the game is random, card shuffle and draw, but the players are able to assess and react to that randomness using their game knowledge and bluffing skills. Also notable in poker, the ability to check, or essentially do nothing, is actually a powerful example of player agency, as it gives the player a chance to control their stakes in that hand and the overall game. Folding is similar. It gives players a chance to cut their losses and avoid raised stakes. The blind, or ante, is a forced bet, which serves as the counter mechanic to folding and checking. By forcing some of the players to put at least some money in every round, there are always stakes involved. So let's talk about the statistics when it comes to cards. What do you think the odds of drawing an ace in 5 draws are? So it starts at 4 out of 52. But to figure out the chance of drawing an ace in 5 draws, we actually need to figure out how our chances of not drawing an ace would be. And this would be 48 out of 52, significantly higher. However, after the first draw, this becomes 47 out of 51, since we have both not drawn an ace and reduced the overall number of cards in the deck. This continues with 46 out of 50 after the second, and so on. Once you have done your 5 draws, multiply all these chances together: 48 out of 52, 47 out of 51, 46 out of 50, 45 out of 49, 44 out of 48. We get 0.66, or 66%, to not draw an ace. Therefore, the total chance of drawing an ace is 34%.
And now it's time for our action step exercise. Think back about what we talked about in this video, where it comes to player agency, probability and randomness, as well as stakes. How can you use these 3 principles to help drive the playability of your game? How much choice or agency do your players have during your game? How will your game mechanics and rules support this? Is your game based more around randomness or more on a skill? How will randomness be determined in your game? And why are you using that method versus others? What are the stakes in your game? Are your stakes large game ending stakes or smaller turn by turn stakes? Answering these questions will help you get players invested in playing your game, and they'll have more fun doing it.
So here's an update on our auctioning card game, which we're actually going with Galactic Auctioneer now. We've settled on a theme. We'll talk about that more later, though. We've moved past the initial concept of our auctioning game, and now we're working on building it into a bigger and better game. You can see how we've started expanding from the mechanical concepts into more focused mechanics and even a few concrete rules. One of the big concerns right now is how to handle the players' decks expanding with the game length and setting a goal for players to achieve that could be done without totally wiping out their opponent's decks. We aren't quite there yet, but we're going to try and make a working prototype using these mechanics so we can start iterating further. And we'll talk some more about that in our next video, prototyping.